All right. So the last section of this class we're going to dive into is called Rise of Race-Neutral Racism. So this has to do with a lot of, we're still going to be talking about racism as a system, but we're going to be talking about how a lot of these systems, don't intend to be racist, or they do, and they're very good at hiding the racism. But the end result, regardless, the end result is there's a lot of racist outcomes that we have to deal with. So we really got to get good on this, because, like I said, like, it's easy to identify, the explicit, open racists, the people, marching in the street with hoods, or tiki torches nowadays. That's really easy. It's easy to look at Trump and see, how racist that guy is. But and we need to confront that stuff. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this isn't a pass to those people. We need to confront those people, and at the same time, we need to understand the systems that are producing systemic racism and white supremacy in this country. I really like this cartoon. I think this goes with a lot of things that we're about to talk about. This idea that we caused all this pain and suffering and made all this wealth from Black, Indigenous people of color, and then we all of a sudden outlawed it with civil rights bills and things like that, and then and now, but we didn't do anything to fix the past harm. We didn't do anything to, outlaw new forms of racism. And now, when Black people are trying to, advocate for themselves, we act like, everything, post-racial racism's fixed. We made it. Why can't you all? So I think this cartoon really does a good job on that. So the first thing, I'm just going to read a couple quotes about what we call racism by omission. So omission being like, racism, by not specifically saying racism, but more about, what, systems that how our systems and laws and who don't, don't specifically have anything racist in them, how are they directly affecting and pushing racism? So the first one's by Matthew Demont. Colorblind racism: when racially neutral language makes extreme racial inequalities appear to be natural outcome of innocent private choices or free market forces rather than intentional public policies like housing covenants, federal mortgage redlining, public housing segregation, and school zoning. So I think this is a big one, because we're going to talk about things like redlining and stuff, and we often try to push the blame onto private industries. These are private companies and private choices, and white flight was about a bunch of individual choices of people leaving neighborhoods, urban areas for suburbs. In reality, there was systemic, there was policies that pushed all of these things. Barrett Institute for Justice, a really great organization that does amazing reports on the racism in our criminal justice system. They said legislators in the U.S. no longer explicitly write laws in the racially discriminatory manner that marked the Reconstruction era, but even laws that are neutral on their face are disparately impact Black people. And then the last quote is a little bit long, but this is an amazing article. Jacquel German, I believe, I apologize if I mispronounced that, but so she wrote an amazing article. I would definitely recommend reading. It's called The Insidious Problem of Racism by Omission. But I'm just going to read. It was really hard just to pick a little bit of the whole article. It's just fantastic. But it says, though there are plenty of malicious racist actors operating in countless spaces across the country, white supremacy has organized itself so that there need not be any admitted or overt racist intent in order to perpetuate institutional racism. The by omission aspect of American anti-Black racism is that racism without racist phenomenon. Racism is built into our country in such a way that the fuel it needs to operate is produced casually without much attention or notice with increasingly regularity. What we know of white supremacy and American anti-Black racism is that it adapts quickly, transforming its language appearance without sacrificing much of its effectiveness. American anti-Blackness by omission doesn't look like the more overt anti-Blackness we train to recognize. It doesn't look like signs on water fountains or burning crosses on lawns. It looks like Black men and women being shuffled in massive numbers into the U.S. prison system, coincidentally the one place slavery is still constitutionally permitted. It looks like deeply segregated neighborhoods and public schools more than 6 decades decades after Brown versus Board was decided. Despite the efforts of desegregation with underfunded schools serving primarily low-income Black students. Homicide by omission means no one deliberately poisoned the water, but when the lead shows up, it shows up in schools and communities with majority Black populations in Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, and elsewhere. We know that the neglect, the absence, the omission does not need to be deliberate in order for it to be effective. This is perhaps the greatest sign of its efficiency. The structure of white supremacy means systems can and does operate as if by happenstance without an evil mastermind turning racism's wheel forward. So I think a great example of this, one of the reasons why we have a Black Lives Matter movement, it's not, there are a lot of very openly racist people or very covert, cleverly racist people who say, things like all lives matter, blue lives matter, and all that stuff when in reality, those quotes are meant to imply that Black lives don't matter as much as everyone else. In reality, until Black Lives Matter, no, all lives can't matter. But a lot of people who are on board with that, are on board with Black Lives Matter. There's not a lot of them saying, you're not saying Black lives don't matter. They're on board. They have signs, they're quoting hashtags and stuff. And you should keep on doing that. We need to promote, especially amplify and promote, never co-opt, the voices of Black leadership right now in the Black Lives Matter movement and similar organizations. But at the same time, we need to understand that it's not just that, it's not about saying Black Lives Matter. It's about being complicit and complacent in supporting systems that devalue Black lives. So, a lot of times people aren't saying Black lives don't matter, but instead they're just supporting systems that devalue Black lives. And that's important to understand. You could believe Black lives matter, but, if you're going to call the cops on non-life threatening, situation with Black people, then, you're devaluing Black lives. If we support, how we currently fund most of our schools, which is based on racial segregation and inequality of resources, and we're supporting systems that devalue Black lives matter. Same with housing discrimination, gentrification, all these things are happening. We could say we value Black lives, but really, as James Baldwin said, I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. And that goes with if people that are more angry, if you're more angry that the property destruction from George Floyd protests rather than the fact that George Floyd was murdered on camera. That's a way to devalue Black lives. Voting for politicians, obviously Trump, but even Biden has a long history with creating legislation that devalues Black lives. So people that were, supporting them in the primary, none of them, I doubt any of them can ever consider themselves racist or involved racist, but, and then there's a lot of reasons why they probably support them, but at the same time, they're supporting a candidate that does, devalue or has, at least in the past, and has not, made up for it properly. So it's, we need to understand that stuff. And at the same time, that was a primary, and then I understand we got to do what we got to do in the normal election, but that comment was more focused on the primary. And then whitewashing a lot. I see a lot of progressive liberals that don't consider themselves racist, but often use things like PC culture and culture wars and cancel culture to basically minimize and downplay anti-racism work and social justice work. We're actually going to talk about the history of the PC culture a little bit today, and a lot more later, and just how that has been used as a weapon to destroy or to hide racism and downplay anti-racist efforts, justifying, the meritocracy myths, you're saying it's just a few bad apples. We just need to reform police a little bit, because overall it's okay. All these things are just selling us, pushing these systems that devalue Black lives. A big thing, a big thing too is a class reductionist policy. So I have a lot of friends that are class reductionists, and they they mean really well. I mean, they're really well, they know a lot about their history of our class, and class is a huge thing. But we need to understand that it's not just one thing, it's not just a reductionist, we have to look at race and class and patriarchy and all these different things and create policies that address all of them. Like if you remember, like in 2016, Black Lives Matter would protest, they protested several of Bernie Sanders' rallies. And I love Bernie Sanders, I wish, just be honest, I'm supportive of him, but and at the same time, he has a very class reductionist view on this country. Like he believes that if we just give everyone decent paying jobs and give everyone healthcare, that racism is just going to disappear and we don't need to worry about reparations and specific racist things. And I'm all for that. Like yes, let's give everyone a great job. Let's give everyone healthcare. Yes. But if we do all that, we're still gonna, white people are still gonna, white men are still gonna make more money than women and Black Indigenous people of color. There's still gonna be racial bias in our police systems. There's still gonna be a racial wealth gap of 16, times. We need to do, yes, let's give everyone jobs. Let's give universal health care, which is going to do a lot because, not having healthcare is just, disproportionately hurting, Black Indigenous people of color. But at the same time, we need to understand that it's not just class, and if we just focus on class, we are pushing ideas that are devaluing Black lives, so even if we're just staying silent as we're watching all this stuff happening, that silence is a form of devaluing. So we have to understand that it's not, it's not just a slogan. It's not just like, I'm going to sign some commitment or I'm going to, like some posts, do all that stuff and realize that the real issue are the systems that are devaluing Black lives. Not just that, we can get everyone to post that hashtag in the world and we would still have the same problems that we do today. So, and again, not to, please keep on posting that hashtag, keep on supporting it, but understand that we need to, do more than that. Like, I really like this quote, 37 states have Black Lives Matter painted on the road. Only one has ended qualified immunity for police. Qualified immunity is, we'll talk more about this in the criminal justice, or the mass incarceration month, but qualified immunity is basically just it's a state giving police, as long as they're doing things in the scope of their job, they have total immunity for saying, if they brutalize people and kill people. So we're a lot of people are trying to end that, and one state has, I can't remember who, I think it was Colorado, but don't quote me. So, but then, all these state, people are, I live in DC and our mayor painted, Black Lives Matter on the streets. And it's an Aaron situation. It was really cool. It was a lot cooler when, Black Youth Project, came in and but that equals defunding the police. But and at the same time, our mayor is not, has zero interest in defunding our police and even reforming them. We're in a mass, budget deficit right now where we're cutting all kinds of funding to like healthy school meals, to violence prevention programs, and at the same time we're adding like 17 million to our police budget. So it's nice, gesture is nice, but these things alone aren't going to really do it. We need to have legitimate policies and legitimate reforms and legitimate defunding and reallocation of resources. That's what it means to like believe that Black Lives Matter. All right, so we're going to start. I'm going to do a series of little, just little history lessons on, talking about race neutral systems. But all these things we're going to dive deeper in throughout the course. So I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on a couple of things and talk about that. And the first one is what it was like when we ended slavery. The transatlantic slave system, enormous amount of wealth. It funded the industrial revolution in America and in U.S. and in Europe. It built modern day Europe. Like a majority of the first industrial revolution was based on textiles, and the majority of the material, cotton, came from enslaved work. So we have to understand that, enormous amount of wealth, trillions of dollars in today's, estimates were built, building this nation, giving power to colonial governments and later to, the United States and to European governments. And then when it ended, there was a brief moment where people tried to, particularly the radical Republicans, who were just complete opposite of modern day Republicans, just as a reference, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, and the other reason why we have, arguably they helped push the 13th Amendment, but the reason why we have 14th Amendment and 15th, right to vote and citizenship and things like that, for black, it was black men at the time, but they did, they tried to push 40 acres and a mule, all these, forms of reparations. And ultimately, it was during this period called Radical Reconstruction, but ultimately it failed. It didn't fail. It was pushed aside by the return of white supremacy in our South. But other than that, there was zero effort, for any form of reparations or just any effort. So there's a lot of new literature coming out, for the first couple of years, when slavery was outlawed, that was just it was insanity. It was just massive lynching. Tens of thousands of black people were dying from famine and diseases and public health situations, and it was a brutal period. So we teach this as like, oh, we emancipated all the enslaved people, yay, everything's great. In reality, because that's all we did, and we didn't actually build on an economic base or like we did with the white people. It was a horrific situation that we still haven't climbed out of, and that's why it's so important that we talk about reparations and how to, even today we need to fix this. So I'm going to play a quick video of Martin Luther King talking more about this.
What is it about the Negro in every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it? Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
White America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Right. And then some more, like another form of race-neutral racism. A lot of it has to do with specific language in our legislation. So we had a lot of great, legislation amendments and bills coming out after the Civil War, but they really just focus on a specific language. They define racism as specific words, and it was super easy for people to just kind of get past that and rename everything. So there's a great quote Ibram Kendi wrote, discriminatory racial language, not racial inequalities, became the proof of racism for the federal courts. The apparatus charged with a huge burden of enforcing equal treatment. It was like writing laws for premeditated murders and not writing manslaughter laws for murders that the state could not prove were premeditated. The shrewdest discriminators switched tactic and simply avoided using racial language to veil their discriminatory intent to get away with racial murder. And we see this, with the 13th Amendment was a law that, outlawed slavery, but it left a big gap, except for its punishment for crime. And from there, we saw all these new systems where basically right after slavery, when a lot of the old Confederate governments were returning just under a different country, but same people, they created all kinds of like those black codes and they vagrancies laws. And they basically outlawed black life, and it was like, it was things from like you couldn't walk on a certain side of railroad tracks. You couldn't be out at past dark at certain times. You couldn't do, all these simple things. And then they only enforced it on black people, and that, arrested a lot of them. And then they created a convict leasing system where they would then, after they arrested them, they would lease them out to these, same plantations, mines. And this was even way more brutal in slavery, because at least in slavery, you had, people were investments that you had to, you wanted to, at least keep alive long enough to, make a lot of money off of. With convict leasing, they would get a new batch of people every month. So, a lot of people died during convict leasing. And at the same time, in order to avoid that, because they outlawed all these different, you couldn't be, do anything, any professions, but sharecropping, basically. Sharecropping was debt peonage. Is where they go back to the same plantations they used to work at. They would get a little piece of land, some farm, equipment and stuff, but they had to, get everything from the owner, and they would charge, high rates, and then they would have to pay them back when they sell the harvest. But the idea was they would never be able to make enough to pay back, and they would essentially become further and further in debt. So we call a lot of these systems slavery by another name. So it wasn't, they didn't use the word slavery, but it was just as brutal, if not worse. And then, the 1866 Civil Rights Bill was trying to outlaw black clothes, but they left out, big holes on voting rights. They left out, it basically just said anything that was explicitly said racist things was outlawed. But again, they could just continue doing poll taxes and all these other things that were, didn't say racism, but didn't say anything racial, but were definitely had racist outcomes. And same with 15th Amendment was when black people were granted the right to vote, but at the same time, it didn't say anything about voter oppression, like literary tests, poll taxes, white-only primaries, things like that, intimidation, it wasn't addressed at all. So even though they got the right to vote, and there was a couple, during Radical Reconstruction, there was actually, they enforced this quality, they had military zones down there, and they enforced, voting. And really for like, half a century, it was probably the most representative government of black people in the South in the history. But then that was when the military was withdrawn, white supremacy and white terrorism took over, and basically for the next century, black people weren't voting. And I really like this timeline is made by Josh Tucker. It talks about, yes, slavery was this long block. And we had a brief moment of Reconstruction that was turned into Jim Crow, segregation, we had felony disenfranchisement. And we hear a lot about felony disenfranchisement, the fact that, felons can't vote. That came about as a way to keep, black people from voting after slavery ended. And then white terrorism, convict leasing, debt peonage, which is sharecropping, New Deal, redlining, we'll talk about in a second, and war on drugs, mass incarceration. So it really, we talk about reparations, but it's not just for slavery, it's also for all these other systems that erupted after slavery. And the big one, a big form of oppression. So when we talk about like white flight, how like white people used to live in urban areas. A lot of people moved in urban areas, including black people during wars. World War I, World War II, to get jobs. There's a lot of factory jobs. But then afterwards, you know, a lot of white people moved away from the urban areas into these into suburbs. And we talk about this. We teach this like a bunch of personal decisions. White people are just, you know, we're scared about black people moving in and just moved out, and that was that, you know. But in reality, what white flight really was this massive federal investment into white people and white home ownership called the New Deal, and later also the GI Bill. So what the New Deal was, it was primarily, it was like three, you know, sections. It was you know, it was workers' rights, you know, a lot of like you know, like overtime laws and child labor laws and union laws and things, and it was also, they had social services, social safety nets. That was the second part of it. And then the third part was home ownership. You know, FDR knew that, you know, in order to build a strong middle class, home ownership was one of the best ways to accrue wealth and get people out of poverty. But in order to pass this, you know, during the Great Depression, there was, you know, after Reconstruction, you know, was forced out from white supremacy, you know, for the next century in the South was basically, the South was controlled by white supremacy, like, you know, the Confederates at first, but eventually involved into like the Dixiecrats, you know, Strom Thurmond and all these people who literally just opposed anything that had to do with desegregation, integration, civil rights, things like that. So in order to pass this is much needed legislation, the New Deal during the Great Depression, and I say they because I don't know who, you know, if it was FDR, it was his cabinet people, it was Congress who did it, but they basically had to find really clever ways to exclude black people from the New Deal. And so what they did is they excluded, you know, for the workers' rights and union rights, they looked at they found the two industries where most black people were working in, and they excluded those two industries. That was farm workers and domestic, you know, house workers, domestic workers. So those were excluded from, you know, right to unions or right to have, you know, wage, you know, minimum wages and things like that. And then and same with safety nets, those are excluded from the Social Security safety nets as well. But then when it came from the home loans, they found a really clever way to do this called redlining. And basically with home ownership, like before, they created what's called the Federal Housing Association. That because before, you know, to get a home loan, you would have to pay half the loan up front and then pay the rest off in a couple of years, which is crazy. I mean, not only rich people were buying homes at that time. So what the FDR government did is they created the Federal Housing Association and a couple other agencies as well that basically backed and insured bank loans, allowing them, you know, take the risk off so they can give more, you know, better terms, like the terms that we have today, where you can only for a small down payment and then you have like 30 years to pay the house off. So they did that, but again, in order to get this passed, they had found a way to exclude, you know, black people. So they turned to the private industry, the real estate industry, who, you know, the government at the time, during some Supreme Court cases against racial covenants and racial zoning and things. I mean, they weren't allowed to exclude racially for housing, you know. But I mean, they found a lot of ways to do that. I mean, mainly they looked to the private industry that was still legally allowed to racially discriminate for housing. So they hired the real estate agencies and real estate industry to basically create risk assessment maps. So we went to every municipality in the country, you know, and they looked at all the, you know, neighborhoods, and they color coordinated, you know, which ones were low risk neighborhoods and which ones were high risk. But they didn't do it. Basically, the only thing they really looked at was race. So if it was a white community, it was low risk. If it was a mixed community, it was medium risk. If it was a black community, it was high risk. And they painted different colors, and the high risk got red color, and that's where we get redlining. So essentially, anyone living in the red zone, which was basically all black people, were refused home loans. And this happened. This continued. You know, it started in the 1934s when the Federal Housing Association started, but it went up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed and outlawed that. Even though redlining continued for another decade and still continues today in different forms. But in between that, you know, from 1934 to 1968, 98% of home loans went to white people. So that's an enormous amount of wealth that was given to white people. And not only home loans, but a lot of these funds were used to build new homes, build new subdivisions, especially with the GI Bill funded entire subdivisions. And in order to get that funding, those developers to get that funding, they had agreed to put on, racial covenants, which are basically racial deeds that say only white people can rent in these homes, or sell these homes. So they pumped in billions and billions of dollars in building, homes mainly for white people and suburbs for white people. And then, this lasted, and then the same with GI Bill came, like that GI Bill had billions of dollars for education for returning veterans, mainly just white returning veterans. Most black veterans were excluded from this. So, and this is a quote from Abram Kendi, more than 200,000 war veterans used the bill's benefits to buy a farm or start a business, 5 million purchased new homes, and almost 10 million went to college. Between 1944 and 1971, federal spending for former soldiers in this model welfare system totaled over 95 billion. As with the New Deal welfare programs, however, black veterans faced discrimination that reduced or denied them the benefits. Combined with the New Deal and suburban housing construction and developments that found legal ways to keep blacks out, the GI Bill gave birth to a white middle class and widened the economic gap between the races. A growing disparity, blamed on poor black fiscal habits. Oh, the growing disparity was blamed on poor black fiscal habits. So, so eventually, the New Deal. I mean, this was the case until the LBJ's Great Society. So LBJ, I mean, he did a lot of things that harmed a lot of people, black, indigenous people of color, specifically starting the war on crime that turned into the war on drugs. But he did a lot, with Vietnam, a lot of policies. But his Great Society really opened up a lot of these New Deal programs for black people, and in return, we saw just the raise of the conditions of living, the public health of the black communities. It gained a lot during LBJ's Great Society, but at the same time, all the civil rights bills, they didn't they didn't create like a Black New Deal. They didn't give any economic justice or reparations or anything like that. They just outlawed, continuing this exclusion. So I like to talk about like an example of what that might look like today. So imagine, in 2008, we had a Great Recession. A lot of people were hurting. And imagine we had a government that was like, well, you need to do something. You need to help these people out. So what they decided to do was, invest $1 trillion, which I read is about equivalent of how much, today of how much money was invested throughout the New Deal and GI Bill. Was, around $1 trillion. Over the next 30 years to invest money just to be invested in white people, white home ownership, white education, like imagine, and we're only like, 2008 recession, we're only like, 12 years into it. So imagine another, 18 years of just straight up, investment into white people, white ownership, white wealth. And then, we had GI Bills where we started investing into, white education. They had highway acts, where they would, tear down thriving black communities, to build highways to these new white suburbs. They had, all these things happen. And then after 30 years, we passed some civil rights bill saying that was wrong. We're not going to do it anymore. But no Black New Deal, no reparations, and we're going to leave a lot of holes for a lot of these things to continue doing it, just in different names and different, language. And then when black people are complain or want their own, economic justice, we're going to tell them, white people, don't, we're going to call that reverse racism. We're going to tell them it's all about personal responsibility, pull themselves up with their bootstraps. There must be something wrong with your culture. We're going to create myths about the absentee black father, which is total BS. We're going to, Nixon created this idea of black capitalism. He didn't invest any money in the black capitalism, but he just kept on saying black capitalism, is going to solve everything. So we really need to understand just like the enormous, like the New Deal and the GI Bill really, it's not only responsible for creating the white middle class, but it's responsible for creating the racial wealth gaps and the segregation that we have today. And then we have limits on the 60 on a lot of these bills. So we talked about a lot of these bills. They really had the civil rights bills, the big ones. The 64 Civil Rights Act. I think it's 65 voting right, and the Fair Housing 68. I mean, they were great pieces of legislation, super important. There were huge fights to get these legislation passed through. And at the same time, they fell far short from what was needed. Like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it outlawed, Jim Crow and explicit and intentional forms of racism. But one, it allowed, de facto racism like banking, redlining, all these things to continue, and it allowed it did nothing to repair the past harm. So we read just the first quote, another one of Ibram Kendi. And so as much as the Civil Rights Act served to erect a dam against Jim Crow policies, it also opened up floodgates for new racist ideas to pour in, including the most racist idea to date. It was an idea that ignored the white Head Start, presumed that discrimination had been eliminated, presumed that equal opportunity had taken over, and figured that since blacks were still losing the race, the racial disparities and their continued losses must be their fault. Black people must be inferior, and equalizing policies like eliminating or reducing white seniority or instituting affirmative action policies would just be unjust and ineffective. The Civil Rights Act in 1964 managed to bring on racial progress and progression of racism at the same time. And so the next two Civil Rights Acts were the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And the Voting Rights Act, it eliminated this explicit forms of poll taxes, white-only primaries, grandfather clauses, some felony disenfranchisement, but a lot of it still, maintains. But at the same time, it allowed for a whole new version of voter suppression to emerge. Voter ID laws, which sounds so simple. Everyone just get an ID, go vote. But we don't understand that in many states there's these huge, there's a lot of barriers to get an ID, particularly if you're living in poverty, or if you're living on a native reservation. There's a lot of barriers to getting voter IDs, and people who initiate voter ID laws know that specifically that the barriers mainly fall along Black, Indigenous people of color, and mainly Democrat voters. So only people that vote, push these things, at least I'm aware of, are Republicans, because they know Democrats are going to lose votes. And same with political gerrymandering, which we'll talk a lot about, in the voter suppression session, and eliminating, early voting, having tons of machines. I had friends in Kentucky in this last primary, and some of my friends, they lived in white, 90% white areas, and they were like, they were great. There was no lines. We got in and out. And then other areas, there was one polling station for 600,000 people living in the in the most Black district in Kentucky. So that's very intentional. That making it extremely hard and making people wait huge barriers to voting. And then the Fair Housing Act, it outlawed, it was a great act. It outlawed a lot of housing discrimination, but it allowed certain race-neutral discrimination, like exclusionary zoning laws. So exclusionary zoning laws, the biggest one is the single-family unit. So if you look at a map of DC, and you look at affordable housing, and all affordable housing is concentrated in the poor Black neighborhoods, which you think, it sounds like, let's put, that in the poor Black neighborhoods, but reality is, public housing is best as a decentralized model, because what you're doing when you're putting all that into the Black neighborhood, you're just concentrating the poverty in that Black neighborhood, and you're reducing the economic opportunity. You're putting more strain on the schools, when in reality, if you put it throughout the city, and then people are able to span out, and people can actually access better schools and hospitals, and you're not concentrating that poverty. You're spreading it out and allowing more opportunity. But if you look at DC map, it's very concentrated affordable housing. There's no housing in what's called west of the Rock Creek Park, which is all primarily white rich neighborhoods, or richer neighborhoods, and that's because they have single family units. Zoning. That means that, because if you're going to build affordable housing, you're going to do a multi, apartment complex, things like that, try to make it as efficient as possible. But they outlawed that stuff, and they say it's, just to preserve the facade or whatever of the neighborhood. But reality is, they know if they do that, affordable housing can't come in to their neighborhood, so they can stay very white and rich. and not have to share the resources. And so that really came about, in the early 1920s by President Hardy, who, right after like Baltimore tried to do, they tried to create a racial zone, where they tried to say only white people could live in this zone and black people can live in that zone. That got kicked out to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said you can't do that. So immediately afterwards, President Hardy put a task force together, mainly of very outward open segregationists, and who worked on different very clever zoning policies. And they sent them to like hundreds of cities in this country to help them develop zoning. A lot, mainly exclusionary zoning, where they did, single family units, but they also zoned, industries, toxic industries, and like, dumps and things in black communities. And because they knew that eventually white people, they couldn't hold these racist policies and barriers for forever. Eventually black people would be able to come in. They knew that, and they wrote about that. They wrote about one way to do that, to keep us segregated, is to make sure white people accumulate enormous amount of wealth through their housing, and black housing is devalued, so putting toxic industries into black communities, and devaluing their homes so they can't ever actually afford to move in. And that's the big one. On affordability is a big one, because that, a lot of people just say, oh, it's a free market, anyone could live anywhere now, it's just a free market, but in reality, I'm going to read this quote. Richard Rothstein from Color Law, amazing book you should read, all about redlining and housing discrimination and things. 70 years ago, many working in lower middle class African American families could have afforded suburban single family homes that cost about $75,000 in today's currency with no down payment. Millions of whites did so, but working in lower middle class African American families cannot buy homes for $350,000 or more with down payments of 20% or $70,000. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited future discrimination, but it was not primary discrimination, although this still contributed, that kept African Americans out of most white suburbs after the law was passed. It was primarily on affordability. The right that was unconstitutionally denied to African Americans in the late 1940s cannot be restored by passing the Fair Housing Act that tells their descendants that they can now buy homes in suburbs if they can only afford it. The advantages of the Federal Housing Association and the Veterans VA loans gave the white lower middle class in 1940s, 50s had become permanent. So even now, it's like, it's totally fine. Black people can move into any community they want, but they've been, these black communities of color have been forced into these, concentration of poverty, while white communities have been heavily invested in and accrued an enormous amount of wealth, to the tune that they have 16 times the amount of wealth as black communities. So now, even though it's legal, no one can afford, black people can't afford to move into these white communities with good white schools and good white hospitals and all that stuff. So segregation is still, around. Even after we outlawed all this stuff. I'm gonna play this quick quote about MLK. So MLK, we're gonna talk a lot about MLK's whitewashed image in their whitewashed history course, because he, we teach, at least for me, I was taught MLK had a dream, it came true, civil rights bills were passed, racism's over, everything's great now. In reality, that he realized really quickly that these civil rights bills were not, it wasn't going to fix things. It needed economic and political justice and restructuring and reparations and things. And that is what eventually got him killed. He was actually a pretty amazing radical person that it's a shame that we don't teach this whole history. But I'm going to play this clip real quick.
I have a dream. My poor little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rates, so to speak. That didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. Now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
All right. And the top and the background of all this, the background of these 60 rights, these civil rights pushes in the 60s, and was also the rise of the modern Republican Party. And we really don't teach this at all in our schools, even though this party controls majority of our government right now. And I'm not saying this to push people to vote one way or another, but we all need to understand the history of this, because if you ask most people, the history of the Republican Party, they'll trace it back to Abraham Lincoln, and these two parties couldn't stand for different things. So what really happened was, and why those big civil rights bills and being pushed again, the Democrats were mainly run by the Dixiecrats and Strom Thurmond in the South, and this was like after Reconstruction there was a solid century of white supremacy and opposed any kind of civil rights bills or legislation. And then during the 50s, there was these pushes for these civil rights bills, particularly a lot of the Southern civil rights strategies, particularly in Birmingham, Alabama, was to use, because in the 50s, the TV was becoming popular, so suddenly everyone was getting the TVs, and then they were sending, so they purposely put themselves in harm's way with especially particularly with the children's crusades and the Bloody Sunday, and they would just get brutalized by Bull Connor and all these awful really racist Southern people in power, and they would tape it and send it out to the rest of the country, who was because of segregation had no idea any of this was happening, just thought black people were complaining too much. And that really, even like JFK did not want to deal with racism at all. And when he saw the video of the kids being attacked by dogs, in the children's crusades, that really shook him up and pushed him towards, trying to actually, start, people argue how much he actually's done, but it wasn't until those moments that he actually started feeling like he needed to do something. So then, the Democrat Party started to, get more involved with, civil rights and particularly with JFK and really with LBJ, when he took over. Most of our civil rights bills wouldn't have been passed if it wasn't for LBJ. The guy was like a genius when it came to passing bills. At this time, the Democrats were pretty, that Dixiecrats and Strom Thurmond and all was really leading the charge. They just couldn't take it. So a lot of them moved back towards the Republican Party, particularly after Barry Goldwater was the candidate in '64, because he went on a very racist platform. Even though he was mainly anti-New Deal, but he really activated the racist platform in the South, and that really showed people that there was he got a lot of even though he lost the election, he dominated the South at a time when the South was the biggest beneficiary of the New Deal, of all these great policies, keeping millions of white people, giving them livelihoods, but they still were willing to trade that all away for a candidate that was anti-New Deal but also anti-civil rights. So that really started this thing called the Southern Strategy, where they started realizing it wasn't just the South, it was a strategy used all over the country. They started realizing there was a lot of support for not just racist candidates, because at the time, with the television and the filming of a lot of the brutality, being a racist was not socially acceptable anymore, during the 50s and 60s. But at the same time, for most people, I mean, if so, for a lot of people, it was socially acceptable. But what the Republicans did is they created this new strategy where they can still force, you still pass, support racist policies, but they would code it in what we call dog whistles, dog whistle politics. Instead of saying, the N-word or segregation or lynching or things, they would start saying, like states' rights, law and order. Law and order, sounds great. We just want law and order. But in reality, law and order was created by Nixon to kind of whitewash the fact that he was brutalizing civil rights activists. Welfare, people loved, welfare when it was only for white people, but when LBJ opened it up to everyone, all of a sudden we started having these, it became this coded phrase for black people are taking advantage of the government, welfare queens and stuff. And for Reagan, illegals, no one's, it's not illegal, for someone to, undocumented person to cross the border. It's like a civil offense, like jaywalking. But when you call them illegals, it sounds like it's just so much more dangerous. And like states' rights, George Wallace, he was a big one on the creation of the Southern strategy. He would always talk about how like he's not a racist, he just wants segregation. And so they start, whitewashing these terms, and what they found is got enormous amount of voter support for this. So much for that Nixon actually won off of this. And then most Republicans since then have been using these racially coded words and policy, to push through policies that ultimately hurt people of color. And then so I'll read this quote. This is from Lee Atwater. He was, we know a lot about this, even though like, some people will deny that Southern strategy existed, but we actually know a lot about it by the people implementing and creating the policies, because a lot of them gave interviews and bragged about how successful, because they were very successful. Even after the civil rights, we gained, culturally we gained a lot during the 60s, but politically, the Republican Party has dominated politics since the 60s, and not just the Republican Party, but these these Southern strategies that even like, people like Bill Clinton, the New Democrats adopted in order to actually win some. So they were very successful. And this guy worked with the Reagan campaign, the Bush campaign to implement, these strategies. But he gave an interview, as I'll read this out. He said, you start out in 1950 by saying the N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract that you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. So they knew what they were doing. They knew, by talking about, cutting taxes and by, talking about law and order that they knew who was, being hurt. And they also, the voters did too. And they knew, and they got an enormous amount of support, not just in the South. I mean, that's the problem with Southern strategy. People think it's just the South, but there's an enormous amount of support for in the North and the West for Southern strategy as well. And if you really want to understand history, this is a great book that really talks about the history of this dog whistle politics. And we're actually going to show a clip of López, I think, next. Yeah. So like this really started with George Wallace and Barry Goldwater, and but they ran unsuccessful campaigns on it. And then Nixon was the first person to really create a successful campaign on Southern strategy. And he did a little bit in his first one, but I mean he went all out on the second one as well. But then it still kept on going, and Reagan really perfected this strategy as well. So I'm gonna play this clip real quick.
Reagan used to talk about welfare queens, but he also had this other stump speech that he would give. He would speak to his audiences and he would say, I understand how frustrating it is for you when you're standing in line at a grocery store waiting to buy a hamburger, and there's some young fellow ahead of you buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Now, the first time he told that tale, it wasn't some young fellow, he said some young buck. And the young buck was a racially coded term that stood for a strong African-American man. And so that term, that moved from being a dog whistle to an outright racial provocation. Reagan backed off and he started talking about some young fellow buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Think about the characters in this story. The first character is the person buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. And that's conjuring the image of the lazy minority who's strong, who could work, but who doesn't want to work and prefers to be on welfare. But The other image is the you in that story, who Reagan's talking to. And the you is ostensibly the voter, the hardworking taxpayer, the law-abiding American. That voter, that hardworking American implicitly has a racial identity, and that's white. So there you can see this racial narrative. You, Reagan is saying to white audiences, you're being taken advantage of. There's a third character here, government. It's government ostensibly that is taking advantage of whites, that is taking their money through taxes and then giving it to these undeserving minorities. So what did Reagan suggest? He suggested tax cuts. You shouldn't have to pay taxes to a government that's just taking your money and giving it to minorities. And indeed, what did he do? He enacted tax cuts. In the first year of his tax cuts, $164 billion went to American corporations. Over the 1980s, the Reagan tax cuts transferred $1 trillion to America's top 1%. Yes, voters got the tax cuts they thought were aimed at cutting off undeserving minorities. But in fact, it was a politics that was showering money on the very richest Americans. We have to understand the way in which something has fundamentally changed in American politics. We used to understand that the biggest threat in a political life was the power of concentrated money, the power of big money and of corporations to hijack the marketplace and to hijack government. But now Republicans for 50 years have been telling voters the biggest threat in your life is that minorities are going to hijack government. The government has been taken over and now serves them. So when white voters vote against government, they think they're voting against minorities, but in fact, they're voting to give over control of government back to the very rich, back to the big corporations.
Right, and to just kind of break that down, I mean, this is another thing that we don't talk about. It's just how harmful the Reagan presidency was, and his disinvestments was to the Black communities. I mean, he did it. It was called neoliberal. Neoliberal was his new movement. That was essentially, it was this, the idea that, the markets are going to fix everything. Let's just give all control, unregulated control to the markets, to privatization, to this privatized social services, all that stuff, because everything, will do it better. Trickle down economics, things like that. In reality, we know that all that does is create enormous amount of poverty and wealth at the same time, and a huge, discrepancies between the two. So, Reagan's neoliberal disinvestments, I mean, he took, hundreds of millions of dollars from social programs, social safety nets, public health programs focused on, dealing with, public health crisis and things like that, and homelessness, and he defunded all of housing, and then put all that money back into huge, tax breaks for the rich, huge military contracts, and a huge investment into his war on drugs. And this is, particularly important to understand because crack was a problem at the time, but instead of dealing with crack like a public health crisis, like how we're dealing with the opiate crisis right now, which is mainly, affecting white people, instead we criminalized it. We're dealing with we're dealing with it as with a giant mass incarceration program. So he took, and that's very intentionally, he used that and create fear, from the Black communities into the white communities about, in order to push these policies through, create a lot of racial, dog whistle politics about how, what these social safety programs were actually doing enormous amount of benefit, were actually, creating dependencies and stuff like that. And literally the Black life expectancy decreased during Reagan's era because it was so harmful to what he did. Most of these cuts were most impacted in the urban areas and in Black communities. And this is about, actually, I do this presentation called The Roots of Food Apartheid, where we actually, we talk about all these previous things that we've been talking about and how that really focuses on plays out into food access into our modern day. And because there's two different approaches to look at food access. There's what's called food desert, which is, it's been around for a long time, since the 70s, but the USDA really made it popular in the last 10 years because they used that approach to kind of look at food insecurity throughout the country. But it's that's all they do is they look at it, how far people from grocery stores, how much poverty and lack of transportation there are in these communities. So they started assessing that, and what they found, or a lot of people found, is there's a huge racial component to all this stuff. Because the idea of food deserts, it paints us like it's just a natural phenomenon, like nothing's wrong with the system. These are just glitches, and if we these food insecure communities, and if we just get them food, problem solved. In reality, there are reasons why these communities can't, produce their own food, and that is, and those roots are directly connected to systemic racism, present and in the past, particularly redlining and disinvestments and gentrification and housing crisis and things like that. So that's why recently there's this new approach called food apartheids, where we want to better understand how a community lacks access to food. It's not just about let's just get them food and problem solve. It's about let's understand what are these underlying causes of food insecurity. Let's get them food, but saying let's address the causes and build food sovereignty and build the ability of the communities to actually have control their food systems. So that's the idea that a food desert, it doesn't sound racist, it's a very race neutral thing, but in reality it's really covering up, that terminology is really covering up the real racist policies and histories that have caused that food insecurity. And then a big part of our race-neutral racism has to do with our Supreme Court. We're going to spend the next 2 slides. We're going to talk about different Supreme Court cases. But so we had, in the 1960s, we had all these great civil rights bills come out, but it's not just enough for legislation. You still have to write regulations and policies, and courts have to create legal precedents that uphold, and they have to decide which, they're the ones that define what is racism, discrimination, all these things. And they did, they started out good. This was definitely what they call the high water case of a Supreme Court understandings discrimination. So it's Griggs versus Duke Power Company. Duke Power Company, in order to advance and get manager jobs, they had these IQ tests and all these, and it required people to have high school diplomas and things. But if you look at where the people are coming from, these well-funded white schools and white neighborhoods, and then black schools with very little funding, these IQ tests are in themselves inherently racist, because they're meant to quiz people on knowledge that on white knowledge in white communities, and then we create this thing called achievement gap, which is another great race neutral term, because the achievement gap focuses just on white students are doing better than black students, and so let's figure out how to fix that, when in reality the reason why they're doing better is because it's systemic racism, because they have better schools, because they're better supported, because they get better jobs, all these things. So the achievement gap is another just dog whistle. It just kind of makes us focus on there's nothing's wrong with the system. It's just we got to do more tutoring and things in the black communities, when in reality this is a result of systemic racism. But anyway, the Duke Power company was using that as a way to basically ensure that all their managers would only be white. And even though they specifically didn't have anything that in these policies that said that, or even mentioned race, the outcome was racist. And so the Supreme Court looked at it, and the SCOTUS finally they gave this quote: "Good intent or absence of discriminatory intent does not redeem employment procedures or testing mechanisms that operate as built-in headways for minority groups." So essentially, they said it didn't matter about your intent. What mattered was the outcome. So they ruled in favor of Griggs. But that was the last time the Supreme Court really did that. I read this quote: "Griggs represented the high water mark for anti-discrimination law. Over the remainder of the decade, conservatives on the court, including Powell and Rehnquist, chipped away at the standard for proving discrimination against non-whites. By 1979, the court had embraced the racism as hate model we continue to struggle under today, demanding proof of malice on the part of a culpable actor. The bar is almost insurmountable. Absent a recorded use use of racial epithet, or in an in-court confession, malice is virtually impossible to prove. Since the Supreme Court adopted the malice test in 1979, it has never found discrimination against non-whites under that approach, not even once. As far as the court is concerned, racism against non-whites must involve proclaimed animus, and that has all but disappeared. So that's essentially saying is like, we started out in the beginning of the 70s, the court realized that it would be impossible to prove proof of malice, so they ruled on the outcome, or whether the outcomes are racist. But then, Nixon, a lot of this too with Nixon appointed a lot of very, very conservative judges who kind of pushed that, away, and they're now saying in order to prove racial discrimination, there needed to be proof of malice. And that means there has to be like a written policy saying that I'm doing this policy to hurt Black people, which is, there's never a written, no one, it's like a confession. No one writes that stuff out. So since then, this particular, it's been almost impossible to prove discrimination based on outcomes. And so we had, and you see this play out in several different cases, personnel administrators of Massachusetts versus Finney, SCOTUS established neutral laws constitutional unless there was proof of malice. So neutral laws that had racist outcomes were constitutional. It was a series of different cases that just kept on, reinforcing that fact. In Mobile versus Bolden, SCOTUS held that disproportionate effect alone, absent purposeful discrimination, or insufficient to establish a claim of racial discrimination. So I'm gonna read this quote. The malice test developed as a mirror to colorblindness, deeming all facially race-neutral government practices presumptuously innocent, imposing an egregiously high burden to prove otherwise. Once embraced as a way of thinking about equality, colorblindness both legitimately and impelled a highly restrictive approach to proving discrimination against non-whites. And that even plays out even more. We see this playing out more and more with the Supreme Court. We have to understand the Supreme Court. I mean, it seems like this neutral body, and there are good decisions that come out of it. Even today, there's good decisions, but there are a lot of bad decisions, and the Supreme Court is very political, and is just a representation of the white supremacy that we have in our society as well, and the patriarchy and many other things. So we have to stop looking at this as like a neutral body, but start understanding how is our society reflected in our Supreme Court. And really great example of the McCleskey versus Kemp case. So this was basically in Georgia in their capital punishment system. So capital punishment came about and it got really popular in the 50s and 60s. And that was the same time that lynching started decreasing. And that's not a coincidence, because people started seeing capital punishment as just as just as corrupt and racist as lynching. All you having a jury of your peers, all white people, white judges, and what they found is, enormous bias. I mean, this wasn't just Georgia, this is all over the country, but in Georgia, the Georgia system was 22 times more likely to impose capital punishment on Black people. So they had enormous amount of evidence. They proved this in court. The Supreme Court accepted that, yes, this has been proved. They accepted that this was a reality, but then they held that a significant risk of racial discrimination did not violate the Constitution. So they held, despite the fact that there was racial discrimination in the outcome, it wasn't enough discrimination in the intent. So that there wasn't a proof of malice. So they said, well, this is just like a random outcome. It just happens. And this essentially, people say to close the doors to claims of racial bias in our criminal justice system. Claims of like legal, like in the court. Like since then, we haven't really, we haven't really done a whole lot in a court-wise to reform our criminal justice system. I think there's another quote, I think it's the next slide I'll read, that talks a lot, but mainly about the criminal justice system is like the one institution out of all of our institutions that was the least affected by our civil rights bills in the 60s. So, and then again, another case, Eastleigh versus Cromartie. I should have practiced some of these names. So this was like gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is basically every 10 years when they do the census, and we have a different demographic map. And the idea is our government's supposed to get together and kind of move, district lines around. So it's, just to respond to the demographic increases or decreases or whatever. Reality is this is used by on both sides, but in the last definitely since 2010, in the last decade, this has been primarily a Republican tool of voter suppression. So they're, so they can move these district lines. So let's say you have, 5 districts that are Democrat, 5 districts that are Republicans. What they can do is they can move the district lines. So all the Democrats, and they make some weird shapes where they capture all the Democrats in 2 districts. Same amount of voters, they're just all in 2 districts. And then Republicans take the other 8 districts. So even though support for Republican Party hasn't changed, they're now dominating. And this happens in dozens of our states right now, where Democrats will get a popular vote, but will have less than half the seats in representation. So the courts, so we tried to send this to the courts to outlaw this, and the courts essentially said that racial gerrymandering by race is illegal, but not by partisan, not by party. But the reality is majority of Black, Indigenous people of color are Democrats. So if you gerrymandering by partisans, you're essentially gerrymandering by racial, but you're by race. But as long as the Republicans can say, we're just doing this by partisans, doing this, by party, we're just, then even though the outcome is racial gerrymandering, the intent wasn't. So this is completely legal. And it's, it's been challenged multiple times, and it's pretty awful. And then we have the rise of mass incarceration. So this is a quote I wanted to read by Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. Though it was the most insidious engine of the subordination of Black people throughout the era of racial terror, right in its aftermath, the criminal justice system remains the institution in American life least affected by the civil rights movement. So this is important because we've had, especially since the 80s, the war on crime was started, and with LBJ, Nixon kind of blew it up, but then it really took off with Reagan, and with a lot of laws. I mean, it's a combination of a lot of things, from a lot of law and order, dog whistle politics, but also ALEC, the American Legislation Something Council. It's a lobbyist organization that basically realized they can make a whole lot of money by bringing back convict leasing, which wasn't outlawed too long ago, and allow private prisons to start making profits. So what they did, they advocated a bunch of legislation that allowed them to start making profits in prisons, and then they went around every state and worked with Republicans and Democrats, a lot of Democrats as well, including people like Bill Clinton and Biden and what they call New Democrats, or tough on crime Democrats. And they worked with them to pass all kinds of, they were race neutral laws, criminal justice laws, but they were primarily, the outcome was primarily felt on Black communities. So mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, and you're gone for life. Drug-free zones, which means if you're in the zone, you have drugs, you get even more consequences. Stand your ground laws, where a hotspot policing, broken windows policy, zero tolerance rules. So all these things, they seem, they don't mention race, they seem very neutral, but the end result is majority of people, that disproportionately speaking, most Black people are the majority in the prisons, or they're disproportionately represent the prison population. So even though they're race neutral, the negative effects were primarily felt during Black communities. I really like this quote. The United States did not face a crime problem that was racialized. It faced a race problem that was criminalized. Because at the time, especially during the war on drugs, this was, there was no huge issue. This started before the crack epidemic, but even then the crack epidemic could have been dealt with as a public health crisis, like how we're dealing with the opiate crisis. But this was all about criminalizing a race, issue. It was about criminalizing Black people for political gain and wealth, and then end result is every part of our police, if you're Black, you're more likely to be stopped and searched and arrested, more likely to receive, be convicted by jury, you receive longer sentences by judges, not qualified for parole, not get bail, all these things. Yeah. And at the same time, we have the school to prison pipeline. So we talked a lot about this already. Because of this like Black criminality that's been pushed, it's anti-Blackness that's been pushed in our society and absorbed in so much of us. Even if we're not conscious of it, we still the outcome is white teachers, and white administrators, are much more harsher on Black students and much more willing to brutalize, suspend, expel Black students. So with this push to have these cops in these schools, you could say, well, the intent was, just to, keep, protect us from these mass shooters. But reality is, children of color are being, hurt more and are experiencing the more negative effects, are being brutalized and arrested and expelled more because for the same offenses that white people do, but they're being more harshly treated. So the more cops in the schools, the more racist outcomes that we have, even if the intent wasn't to be racist. And then I want to talk about the rise of political correctness, the PC culture. So this is, before I jump into this history, I want to talk, I want to do a couple caveats because the history, this was a new history to me when I researched it. And so I want to kind of, pull apart a couple different things because a lot of people use PC culture for a lot of things. So we as a society definitely have our problems with actually giving people assertive feedback. And that is not necessarily on the blame on us, but it's a blame on the fact that we don't teach in our schools how to be assertive, how to give feedback, and we don't teach people how to receive feedback, and we don't teach people so we definitely need to work on giving better feedback and not trolling people and not getting being so in your face, calling in instead of calling out and all these things. So that is an issue, and if anyone's ever experienced that, when it would have been so much better for someone to kind of like work with them through their racism, or instead of just public shaming. So I feel you on that. So please, I do recognize that. And at the same time, we also as white people need to stop tone policing, and we need to build thicker skins because we are not on an equal plane in these conversations. A lot of times it's so much easier for us to just be calm and civil because I've never lost someone. I've never had a loved one be murdered by police. I've never had to experience racial discrimination, so it's easy for me to be calm and have a calm conversation about racial discrimination or police brutality. But if you're a Black person who's lost loved ones, and all of a sudden your white friend posts Blue Lives Matter, it's going to be really hard for that Black person to have, say, anything but anger. And because anger is oftentimes a secondary emotion that covers up, pain and suffering and things like that. So and white people often push this idea that, respectability politics, if they just talk to us nicely, we'll and have dialogues on this, we can figure this out. In reality, no, look, there's so many people like Colin Kaepernick and Martin Luther King who tried that and it doesn't work. That's a, we need to figure out how to, not tone police and how to accept, because a lot of feedback that we were going to get about racism is not going to come in the most pleasant way, and that's okay. We need to be okay with that, and we still need to hear, what that feedback is, instead of, because the problem isn't that people are giving harsh feedback. The problem is that we're supporting racism and systems of patriarchy and things that are killing people, literally killing people in this country. But we like to the cancel culture. This whole idea of it tries to blame the people giving feedback, as opposed to the fact that these celebrities are supporting systems that are killing people. So I think we need to be very careful of that. And also at the same time, I see this a lot where a lot of white people are like, I just want to have dialogues, and you get, because we demand to be able to, that's part of our white supremacy culture is we demand to be able to, assess, we have the moral authority. We need to actually debate this stuff. And not everything is for debate. White people need to understand that it's not okay. Not everything is for debate. Like the humanity of Black, Indigenous people of color is not up for debate. We need to understand that, whether, migrant, asylum seekers of color get to, live in our country or get deported and die in their country, that is not something that white people get to debate on. So we need to understand that as well. And we also, lastly, I wanted to say, we need to understand the difference between free white speech and free black speech. You know, if a black person goes on a college campus and gives a speech about how all white people are evil, you know, that's only going to go so far, and there's only going to be so much, you know, connections to that. But if a white person, you know, white supremacist goes on on campus and gives a speech about white supremacy, that's going to tap into 400 years of white supremacy that's been internalized in our cultures, in our networks, and what the end result of that stuff is, you know, people, black indigenous people of color, they get killed, you know, they die. I mean, there's a direct, you know, there's a direct link between people like Dylan Roof and white supremacist terrorists, and the people that are preaching and going to college, you know, and going to campuses and preaching white supremacy. There's a direct link between, you know, the people that are being killed, the protesters that are being killed by white supremacists and being run over by cars, and the propaganda that Fox is pushing and the Trump is tweeting. So we have to understand that. And our you know, like our courts have done just a shitty job, you know, defining hate speech and defining speech that incites violence. And again, they fall back on the proof of malice. Unless Trump specifically says, get in your car and run over, you know, protesters, he can't be held liable. Even though that, you know, a lot of these people, like the Pittsburgh, you know, synagogue shooting, that was the biggest, you know, anti-Semitic shooting massacre in our country. The guy directly quoted in his manifestation Trump and Fox News on on their bullshit, you know, conspiracy theories to get elected in 2018, that you know, Jewish people and George Soros and all of them were paying, you know, migrant caravans to come into this country. So that guy went to this place, this Jewish synagogue that was working with refugees, and shot up everybody. So we need to start connecting, like, this idea that, you know, free speech allows us, you know, to say or do whatever we want. We need to understand that a white free speech has consequences. That being said, I want to kind of jump into the history of political culture and political correctness, because this I didn't realize this until I started researching it. I don't think many people know this. Before the, you know, in the 1980s, no one used political correctness. I mean, it was found in a couple different places that, like, for as satire off of plays, you know, satiring like Mao's, you know, Red Book and stuff. But no one used it, and it wasn't until, like, this conservative think tank that was really funded by the usual names, you know. But usual family, you know, conservative donors. They were searching for ways to wanted to demonize, you know, this new anti-racism, multiculturalism, all these things. They wanted to demonize it, but they also wanted to separate them from blue-collar Democrat voters. So they created, you know, so they financed these think tanks, which in turn came up with this plan and financed, you know, thousands of conservative writers, you know, from books and movies and all kinds of things, to produce all this content, basically saying that, you know, political correctness, this new movement of political correctness was spreading through colleges. And it was basically dangerous authoritarian thought control. It was, you know, big, you know, they related it to, like, authoritarianism, communism, you know, all this stuff. And then, like, this is, you know, telling, like, this is a really great article Maura Weigel wrote about the history of it. But she said, if you search ProQuest, a digital database of U.S. magazines and newspapers, you find that the phrase political correct rarely appeared before 1990. That year, it turned up more than 700 times, all from these you know, writers that, you know, these think tanks were financing. In 1991, there were more than 25 instances. In 1992, it appeared more than 28,000. Like Indiana Jones movies, these pieces called up enemies from a melange of old wars that compared the thought police spreading terror on universities, campuses to fascists, Stalinists, McCarthyites, Hitler Youth, Christian fundamentalists, Maoists, and Marxists. And, you know, it started out as just like conservative writers, but then, you know, a lot of, you know, non-conservative writers, I mean, like they started, you know, kind of catching on, and they believed this and started writing again, and it just became this, like, movement. And, like, it's a powerful tool right now, even to this day, because, like, if you're, you know, if you're called out for you know, for racism, for sexism, for homophobia, for transphobia, you don't have to ever now say, you know, deal with those consequences of what you said. Now all you have to do is say you're being a victim of political culture, or political culture out of control. I mean, we see this directly with Trump. You know, he was called out numerous times in debates for really awful things that he did, and his response every time was, "I will not bow down to political correctness." You know. And the whole audiences just erupted. You know, these are like the biggest applauses of the whole nights is when they said those kinds of things. In 1991, this was 1 year after no one ever heard of political correctness before, you know, and then 1 year later, President Bush gave a speech identifying PC as a major danger to U.S., particularly to our free speech. So you have to, I mean, this is a very coordinated, very intentional right-wing strategy that it was super effective. I mean, if you look at a lot of the exit polls and studies around people, a lot of people, you know, they say they voted for Trump because of PC culture is out of control. And again, you know, not to say like, I mean, we need to work on better ways to like call in people and to confront stuff, but that's not, you know, but the idea is it no longer is racism, sexism, and homophobia the problem. The problem is, you know, now people calling this stuff out and really demonize, you know, social justice work, demonize culture, multiculturalism. And we're going to dive in our third class this month. We're going to dive a lot deeper into the history of that and really understand more of that, because we need to understand this, because this is something that we need to get past. And then a big race-neutral racism that happens is this post-racial belief, this idea that, you know, racism has been fixed, Martin Luther King's dream came true, and now any, you know, direct, you know, any kind of direct results of racism was now, you know, the responsibility of the communities of color themselves, so the cultural poverty or the black on black crime or ungrateful protesters. And we see this, you know, a big insurgency of this happening right after the civil rights bills, but we saw even bigger after Obama, you know, became president. A lot of people use that as proof that racism was gone. So now they just, you know, they did not want to hear anything else about race. And they're done talking about affirmative action, you know, civil rights movements, Black Lives Matters, all these organizations that were still fighting very real racism, were all, you know, all of a sudden, yeah, I mean, yeah, it demonized them. So I'm going to play a concession speech of John McCain's 2008, after he just heard that Obama lost. And this is definitely Ann's situation. Like, you know, John McCain, like, I mean, you know, is a very, it was full of integrity, this concession speech, you know, like, especially nowadays, like, you know, I think, you know, a lot of people would love to go back to the level of integrity that the Republican Party used to have. And at the same time, he pushed some really bullshit post-racial beliefs. I'll just play it for you.
In a contest as long and difficult as this campaign has been, his success alone commands my respect for his ability and perseverance, but that he managed to do so by inspiring the hopes of so many millions of Americans who had once wrongly believed that they had little at stake or little influence in the election of an American president is something I deeply admire and commend him for achieving. This is an historic election, and I recognize the special significance it has for African Americans and for the special pride that must be theirs tonight. I've always believed that America offers opportunities to all who have the industry and will to seize it. Senator Obama believes that too. But we both recognize that though we have come a long way from the old injustices that once stained our nation's reputation and denied some Americans the full blessings of American citizenship, the memory of them still had the power to wound. A century ago, President Theodore Roosevelt's invitation of Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House was taken as an outrage in many quarters. America today is a world away from the cruel and prideful bigotry of that time. There is no better evidence of this than the election of an African American to the presidency of the United States. Let there be no reason now. For any American to fail to cherish their citizenship in this, the
greatest nation on earth.
Even though I know they're clapping because they're like, I have to believe that they think it's it's a good thing that it's a black person's finally president. But the fact that they're like also clapping because John McCain basically said racism was dead, and we're living in a post-racial society now, and like that belief in itself is much more. It's so dangerous because we are so not in a post-racial world. If you look at the statistics that we went over in the class, like nothing, no outcome right now is representative of a post-racial belief. Like, so it's a dangerous belief. And I believe this is the last slide. I just wanted to kind of talk about all lives matter myth. I just want to read this quote. It's a little bit long, but it's a really great quote. But the problem with being colorblind, aside from the fact that we're not really, is that it is really a white privilege to be able to ignore race. White people like me have the luxury of not paying attention to race, white or black. The reason is because whiteness is treated as a default in our society. Whiteness is not a problem for white people because it blends into the cultural background. Black people, on the other hand, don't have the luxury of being colorblind. They live in a culture which constantly reminds them of a blackness, which tells them in a million large and small ways that they are not as important as white people, that their lives actually do not matter as much as white lives, which is why saying Black Lives Matter is so important. All lives matter is a problem because it refocuses the issues away from systemic racism and Black lives. It distracts it and diminishes the message that Black lives matter or that they should matter more than they do. All lives matter is really code for white lives matter, because when white people think about all lives, we automatically think about all white lives. We need to say Black lives matter because we're not living it. No one is questioning whether white lives matter or whether police lives matter, but the question of whether Black lives matter really matters is an open question in this country. All right, so that leads us to the end of this presentation. So I just want